My own son threw me out of the house with just $20, snarling furiously, "Your place is outside." I bought a rundown shack in the suburbs to survive. Then the mechanic looked at my worn-out truck and said, "These brakes were sabotaged. Someone has been planning your accident for years." The blood drained from my face as the truth hit me. I walked into my son's house, and 5 minutes later, the police arrived. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Delbert Stewart. I'm 67 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I lived in the house I grew up in on East Camelback Road in Phoenix, Arizona. I spent 42 years as an aviation mechanic for Southwest Airlines, specializing in hydraulic systems and aircraft brakes. When you've spent 4 decades making sure planes don't fall out of the sky, you learn to pay attention to details. You learn that every part matters. Every connection counts. I wish I'd paid that same attention to my own son. Chris wasn't always the man he is now. I remember when he was 8 years old, waiting by the window for me to come home from my shift. He'd run out to meet me, showing me drawings he'd made of airplanes. But somewhere along the way, that little boy disappeared. Maybe it started 3 years ago when he married Lisa. She's beautiful, I'll give her that. Tall, blonde, always dressed like she's going to a country club meeting. But there's something cold behind those blue eyes, something calculating. The last 2 years were the worst. Chris worked as a sales manager at a Toyota dealership, always talking about his numbers, his commissions, his targets. Lisa sold real estate, constantly on her phone, always chasing the next big commission. They moved into my house temporarily after their apartment lease ended. "Just for a few months, Dad," Chris said. "We're saving for our own place." That was 2 years ago. The way they looked at me changed. Chris started calling me old man instead of dad. Lisa would walk past me like I was furniture. They'd have conversations in whispers that stopped when I entered a room. I'd catch them measuring the walls, discussing renovations, talking about when we finally have the space to ourselves. I spent most of my time in the garage, working on my project, a 1947 Indian Chief motorcycle I'd been restoring for 5 years. It was my escape, my sanctuary. The smell of oil and metal, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. If only I'd realized that while I was restoring that bike, my own life was being dismantled piece by piece. It all came crashing down on a Monday afternoon in early March. I'd been in the garage since morning, finally getting the Chief's transmission reassembled. My hands were covered in grease, but my heart was light. The bike was almost complete. I walked into the house around 4 in the afternoon, ready to clean up and maybe make some dinner. That's when I found them. Chris and Lisa were in my bedroom, throwing my clothes into black garbage bags. Not even suitcases. Garbage bags. Like I was trash being taken to the curb. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chris spun around, his face twisted with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure contempt. "What does it look like, old man? We're cleaning house. Those are my things. This is my room." Lisa laughed. Actually laughed. "Your room? This is our house now. You've been living here rent-free for too long." My mind reeled. Rent-free? In my own house? The house my father built in 1962? "Chris, son, what's going on? We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," he cut me off, his voice sharp as broken glass. "You're done here. Your place is outside, old man. You understand? Outside. Not in this house anymore." He grabbed my arm. My own son grabbed my arm and started dragging me toward the door. I tried to resist, but at 67, I'm not the man I used to be. Lisa opened the front door, a triumphant smile on her face. "Finally," she said, "our house will be free." Chris shoved me through the doorway. I stumbled, catching myself on the porch railing. He threw a garbage bag after me. It split open, my clothes spilling across the front lawn. Then he pulled out his wallet, took out a $20 bill, and threw it at my feet. "There. Can't say I didn't give you anything." The door slammed. I heard the deadbolt click. Then another lock. Then the chain. I stood there on my own front porch, looking at my clothes scattered across the grass, at that $20 bill lying in the dirt. Behind me, through the window, I could see Chris and Lisa. They were hugging, celebrating. She was actually jumping up and down with excitement. I picked up the $20. folded it carefully, put it in my pocket. Then I gathered what I could carry in my old gym bag and walked to my truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that had seen better days but had always been reliable. I sat in that truck for a long time, just staring at the house where I'd lived for 67 years. The house where my father had carried me across the threshold as a newborn, where I'd learned to walk, to ride a bike, to fix my first engine, where I'd brought Chris home from the hospital, full of hope for the future. That night, I slept in the Walmart parking lot, listening to the sound of shopping carts rattling across asphalt. The next morning, I drove to my bank branch on Indian School Road. The young teller, couldn't have been more than 25, gave me a sympathetic look when I asked for my balance. Maybe she could see it in my eyes what had happened. Maybe I just looked like what I was, a homeless old man. $23,670. That's what 42 years of work, careful saving and living simply had left me. It sounds like a lot until you realize that rent in Phoenix averages between $1,400 and $1,800 a month. At that rate, I had maybe a year before I'd be completely broke. Less if I wanted to eat regularly. I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot, doing math on the back of a deposit slip. I couldn't afford rent. I couldn't go back to my house. I couldn't impose on anyone. I'd lost touch with most of my old coworkers after retiring, and I'd never been much of a socializer anyway. That's when I saw it. A flyer on the community board near the bank entrance. House for sale, owner desperate, $18,000. It listed an address in Mesa, about 20 minutes away. $18,000 for a house. I drove to Mesa. The address led me to a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. Broken sidewalks, yards overgrown with weeds, houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, and at the end of the street, the most run-down property of them all, 1,129 South Mesa Drive. The owner, a tired-looking man in his 50s, was nailing a "for sale" sign in the front yard. "Is this place really 18,000?" I asked. He looked me up and down, saw the desperation I was trying to hide. "For you? 17.5. I'm moving to California next week. Just want it gone." I looked at the house. Shattered windows, missing roof tiles. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Through the broken windows I could see water-stained walls and a floor that looked like it might collapse. "I'll take it," I said. We went to a notary that afternoon. I paid cash. By 6 that evening, I owned a house that most people wouldn't stable a horse in. The next weeks were survival. I had $61.70 left. I spent $300 at Home Depot on basic materials, lumber, nails, plumbing supplies. I spent another $250 on a used window from a salvage yard. Everything else I did with my own hands. Days started at sunrise. I'd patch holes in the roof, fighting off the Arizona heat that made the attic feel like a furnace. The plumbing was a nightmare, corroded pipes that had to be completely replaced. I did it section by section, working with what money I had left. No air conditioning. I couldn't afford to fix the unit, so I slept with all the windows open, sweating through the night. I ate cheap. Ramen noodles, day-old bread from the discount rack, canned beans. I lost weight. My clothes started hanging loose. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, the one mirror that hadn't been broken, I barely recognized myself. Gaunt cheeks, dark circles under my eyes, hands covered in cuts and calluses. But slowly, the house became livable. Not comfortable, not nice, but livable. At night, lying on a mattress I'd pulled from someone's trash pile and cleaned as best I could, I'd think about Chris and Lisa, about that house on Camelback Road, about how easily they'd thrown me out, how they'd celebrated my exile like it was a victory. Something didn't add up. Chris had always been entitled, sure, self-centered. But this level of cruelty, this complete disregard for his own father, it felt wrong. It felt planned. They wanted me gone. Not just out of the house. They wanted me gone. Permanently. But why? Why now? What had changed? I didn't have answers yet. But lying there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing in that broken-down house, I made myself a promise. I would find out. I would understand what they were planning. And then we'd see who ended up outside. The morning heat was already building when I woke up on the salvage mattress. 6 weeks had passed since Chris threw me out. 6 weeks of living on canned food and fixing a house that probably should have been condemned. My hands were calloused, my back ached constantly, and I'd dropped 15 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. But I was still here, still breathing, still thinking. That's when I noticed it, really noticed it. My truck, old reliable F-150, was taking longer to stop at red lights. The brake pedal felt spongy, like pressing into soft clay instead of firm resistance. I'd been an aviation mechanic for 42 years. I knew systems. I knew when something wasn't right. The truck was parked in front of the Mesa house, baking in the mid-April sun. I knelt beside it, my knees protesting against the hot concrete driveway, and peered under the chassis. The brake lines looked wrong, discolored in places, but I couldn't see clearly without proper equipment. I needed a lift. I needed a professional workspace. Cooper's Auto Repair was a 20-minute drive, located in an older industrial area off Van Buren Street. I'd been there a few times over the years when I needed work I couldn't do myself. The owner, Ron Cooper, was one of those rare, honest mechanics, the kind who'd tell you when you didn't need a repair, instead of inventing problems. The shop smelled like oil and hot metal, familiar and comforting. Ron looked up from under the hood of a Camry, wiping his hands on a red rag that had probably been white once upon a time. "Delbert, haven't seen you in a while. What brings you in?" "My brakes," I said, and something in my voice must have caught his attention because he straightened up, really looking at me, taking in my weight loss, my worn clothes, the way I stood like a man carrying a burden he couldn't set down. "Something not right?" "Something's not right," I confirmed. "Can you put her on the lift?" 10 minutes later, my F-150 was suspended in the air, its undercarriage exposed like a patient on an operating table. Ron rolled his creeper underneath, his work light casting harsh shadows. I heard him go very still. "Delbert," his voice had changed, careful, controlled. "Come here, you need to see this." I knelt down, my heart starting to pound. Ron pointed to the brake lines with a screwdriver, not touching them, just indicating. "See here, and here." The metal tubing that carried brake fluid from the master cylinder to the wheels showed clear scoring, fine lines where something sharp had scraped away at the surface. But it wasn't just that. Around the scoring, the metal had a strange pitted texture, like acid had eaten into it. "That's not wear," Ron said quietly. "Someone filed these lines. See the pattern? And this corrosion? This is chemical damage. Someone applied something corrosive to weaken the metal over time." My mouth went dry. "What are you saying?" Ron rolled out from under the truck and stood, his expression grim. "I'm saying someone's been sabotaging your brakes, Delbert, and they've been doing it for a while. Look at the progression. Old damage here, newer damage there. This wasn't a one-time thing. Someone's been systematically weakening these lines, probably over months, maybe longer. How long until they'd fail? At this rate?" Ron examined the lines again. "A month, maybe 2. And when they failed, you'd have been going highway speed probably. No way to stop. The lines would rupture, you'd lose all brake fluid, and—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I felt cold despite the Arizona heat. My hands were shaking. "Who had access to your truck?" Ron asked. And that's when it hit me. Really hit me. The truck had always been parked in the garage at the Camelback Roadhouse. The garage where I'd worked on my Indian Chief. The garage where for the last 2 years, Chris had started spending more time. "Just checking on things, Dad," he'd say, making sure everything's running smooth. Chris, my son, who'd thrown me out with $20 in a garbage bag, who'd celebrated my departure like it was a holiday. Chris, who'd been helping me by checking the truck every few weeks. Chris, who stood to inherit a house worth nearly $1 million when I died. My vision blurred. I grabbed the edge of Ron's workbench to steady myself. "Delbert, you okay?" "My son," I said, and the words felt like broken glass in my throat. "My son had access. He said he was maintaining it for me." Ron's expression darkened. "You need to call the police. Right now." "I need 24 hours, I heard myself say. "There's something I need to check first. Something about the house. Delbert, don't repair it." I cut him off. "Don't touch anything. The police will need to see this exactly as it is. Evidence." Ron studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll photograph everything. Document it all. But Delbert, don't drive this truck. It's not safe. I called a taxi from Ron's office phone. $47 to get back to Mesa. Money I couldn't afford to spend. But I wasn't about to risk driving a vehicle that had been turned into a ticking time bomb. The taxi driver tried to make conversation, but I couldn't respond. My mind was racing, assembling pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Chris had been planning my death, not quickly, not obviously, slowly, carefully, making it look like an accident. An old man in an old truck with old brakes that finally gave out. No one would question it. No one would investigate. Just another unfortunate accident. And then he'd have the house. The house on Camelback Road, in one of Phoenix's better neighborhoods. A house worth $890,000, according to the property assessment I'd seen last year. More than enough to solve whatever financial problems Chris and Lisa had. The taxi dropped me at the Mesa house. I went inside, my temporary shelter, and sat at the rickety kitchen table I'd salvaged from someone's curb. The afternoon light came through the repaired windows, dust motes floating in the air. I sat there for hours, thinking. Chris had sabotaged my truck, spent months, maybe years, weakening the brake lines bit by bit, waiting for me to die in what would look like a tragic but unremarkable accident. When that took too long, when his patience ran out or his debts got too pressing, he'd simply kicked me out instead, probably hoping I'd die on the streets, or that the truck would finally fail and kill me anyway. My own son had tried to murder me. The betrayal should have broken me. Maybe it would have, 6 weeks ago. But 6 weeks of living on almost nothing, of rebuilding a house with my bare hands, of surviving when I should have given up, that had changed me, hardened me. I wasn't the same man Chris had thrown out. That man had been soft, trusting, naive about what his own family had become. This man was angry, and this man wanted answers. As night fell, I made a decision. In the morning, I would make a phone call. There was someone who might have information I needed. Dorothy Miller, an old family acquaintance who'd been the notary when my father's estate was settled, back in 1998. If anyone knew the exact legal details of that house, it would be her. And then I'd go to the police. I'd show them what Ron had found. I'd tell them everything. But first, I needed to know one thing. Was Chris's plan even going to work? Was the house actually his to inherit? Because if I'd learned anything in my years as a mechanic, it was this. Before you can fix a problem, you have to understand every part of the system. And I was starting to suspect that Chris didn't understand the system at all. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay on the salvaged mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, my mind processing what Ron had shown me. The scored brake lines, the chemical corrosion, the methodical, patient evil of it. My son had planned to kill me, not in rage, not in a moment of passion, slowly, carefully, over months or maybe years, making sure my death would look natural, inevitable. Just an old man whose brakes failed at the wrong moment. But why? The house, obviously. But something nagged at me. Some instinct I'd developed over decades of troubleshooting complex systems told me there was a piece missing, a critical component I hadn't identified yet. Morning light through the repaired windows found me already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with instant coffee and a prepaid cell phone I'd bought for $39 at Walmart. I'd been saving Dorothy Miller's number for weeks, ever since I'd thought to look her up in an old address book I'd grabbed during the chaos of being thrown out. Dorothy had been my father's notary back in 1998, when he'd passed away and the house had supposedly transferred to me. She'd been maybe 40 then, which made her about 67 now, the same age as me. I'd seen her at a grocery store once, years ago, but we'd never been close. Just a professional connection from a difficult time. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed. It rang 4 times. I almost hung up. Hello? Dorothy? This is Delbert Stewart, Benjamin Stewart's son. I don't know if you remember. Of course I remember, Delbert. Her voice was warm but cautious. It's been a long time. How are you? How was I? Homeless, targeted for murder by my own son, living in a house that barely qualified as shelter. I need to ask you something about my father's estate, about the house on Camelback Road. A pause, long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Dorothy? What do you need to know? Her voice had changed. Careful now. When my father died in 1998, the house passed to me. That's correct, isn't it? I inherited it. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her weighing her words. Delbert, your father created a living trust in 1997. I witnessed the signing. The house didn't pass to you through inheritance. It was already in the trust. You became the lifetime beneficiary, which gave you the right to live there until your death. But you never owned it outright. The kitchen seemed to tilt. What? The trust still owns the house. After your death, according to your father's wishes, the property transfers to the Veterans of World War II Memorial Foundation. It was his way of honoring his service and his fellow veterans. He was very clear about this. I couldn't breathe. So my son, Chris, can't inherit it? No. Your son has no legal claim to that property. Never did. Never will. I sat in stunned silence. Chris had been planning to kill me for a house he'd never inherit. All that patience, all that methodical planning, all that evil, for nothing. For a house that would go to a charity the moment I died. Delbert, are you still there? I'm here. My voice sounded hollow. Dorothy, I need you to do something for me. I need written documentation of this trust. Everything. Can you provide that? I can pull the files. Delbert, what's going on? I'll explain later, but I need those documents. Today, if possible. Come to my office at 2. I'll have everything ready. I ended the call and sat there, the phone still in my hand. Then I started laughing. Not from humor, from the sheer absurdity of it. Chris had tried to murder me for a house he couldn't have. He'd sabotaged my brakes, weakened them over months, waited patiently for my death. And if he'd succeeded, if I died in that crash he'd engineered, he would have gotten nothing. The laughter died, because Chris didn't know that, which meant he was still dangerous, still thinking he was waiting for a payoff that would never come. I called information and got the non-emergency number for the Phoenix Police Department, asked to speak to someone about attempted murder. They transferred me to a detective, Marcus Gordon, Crimes Against Persons Unit. I explained everything. The sabotaged brakes, Ron Cooper's findings, my son's access to the vehicle, the timing of my eviction. Gordon listened without interrupting, his questions sharp and focused when he did speak. I'll need to examine the vehicle myself, he said. Can you meet me at Cooper's Auto Repair in an hour? I'll be there. I called another taxi, another $45 I didn't have. But this was important. This was evidence that would put my son in prison. The taxi dropped me at the repair shop. Detective Gordon arrived 10 minutes later, a solid man in his mid-40s, dressed in a sport coat despite the heat, his eyes missing nothing as he surveyed the shop. Ron showed him the brake lines, explained the scoring, the corrosion, the systematic nature of the damage. Gordon took photographs, made notes, called in a forensics technician. The technician, a woman with graying hair and careful hands, examined the damage with various tools I didn't recognize. She scraped samples, took measurements, photographed everything from multiple angles. This is deliberate, she confirmed after 20 minutes. The pattern of damage is consistent with manual filing, and these corrosive agents aren't naturally occurring. Someone applied them, multiple times, over an extended period. Can you prove who did it? I asked. She looked at Gordon, who nodded permission to answer. If we can find the tools used, and if they still have residue matching this damage, yes. We'd need to search the location where the vehicle was kept. The garage at 3847 East Camelback Road, I said. That's where my truck was parked. That's where my son had access. Gordon pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke in low tones about search warrants and probable cause. When he hung up, he looked at me with something like sympathy. Mr. Stewart, I need you to understand something. If we pursue this, if the evidence supports what you're saying, your son will be charged with attempted murder. That's 15 to 25 years in Arizona. Are you prepared for that? Was I prepared? To see my son in prison? To admit that the child I'd raised had tried to kill me? He threw me out with $20 in a garbage bag, I said quietly. He sabotaged my brakes and waited for me to die. He's not my son anymore. He's someone who tried to murder me. Gordon nodded. We'll need to interview him. I'd like you to come with us when we do. Why? Because sometimes, when confronted by the person they've wronged, People say things they wouldn't say otherwise, and because you deserve to see his face when he realizes we know what he did. At 2 in the afternoon, I met Dorothy Miller at her office in Scottsdale. She handed me a folder thick with documents: the trust agreement, my father's will, transfer documents, everything proving that 3847 East Camelback Road was owned by a trust, not by me, and would never belong to Chris. Your father was a wise man, Dorothy said. He told me once that he wanted to prevent family conflicts over property. He'd seen too many families torn apart by inheritance disputes. He couldn't have known, I said. He couldn't have predicted this. Maybe not, but he protected you anyway. I took the documents, added them to everything else I'd gathered: photos of the brake lines, Ron's written statement, the detective's card. By 2:30, I was in Detective Gordon's unmarked car, riding toward my old house, the house where I'd lived my entire life, where Chris now lived, thinking he was safe, thinking he'd gotten away with it. You don't have to do this, Gordon said as we pulled onto Camelback Road. You can wait in the car. But I'd already opened the door. I was walking up the path to the front door. The yard looked different. Lisa had planted new flowers, expensive ones. The porch furniture was new too. They'd already started making the place their own. I rang the doorbell, my doorbell, in my house. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Chris stood there, and for just a moment I saw the little boy who used to wait by the window for me to come home. Then his expression changed. Shock, then anger. Then, when he saw Detective Gordon behind me, fear. "Hello, son," I said. "We need to talk about my truck." And I watched the color drain from his face. The transformation was complete. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the old man he'd thrown away like garbage. I was the man who'd survived, who'd figured it out, who'd gathered the evidence. I was the man who was going to make sure justice was served. Behind me, Detective Gordon was reading Chris his rights. Inside the house, I could hear Lisa screaming, demanding to know what was happening. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches, watching the show, and I stood there, facing my son, the man who'd tried to kill me, and felt nothing but cold certainty. This wasn't over. The police would search. They'd find evidence. They'd build a case, and then we'd see who ended up outside. The morning after confronting Chris felt surreal. I woke in the Mesa house to silence. No police sirens, no dramatic confrontations, just the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood coming awake. But nothing was ordinary anymore. Detective Gordon had called the previous evening with an update. They'd executed a search warrant on the Camelback Roadhouse, and what they'd found in the garage made my blood run cold all over again. A set of metal files with distinctive wear patterns, a bottle of brake fluid mixed with battery acid, Chris's homemade corrosive cocktail, and most damning of all, a notebook where he'd documented each maintenance session on my truck. Dates, times, what he'd done. He'd kept a record of his own attempted murder. Some criminals are meticulous, Gordon had said, a note of disbelief in his voice, but I've never seen someone document their own crime quite like this. He treated it like a project plan. Chris was still in custody. The bail hearing was scheduled for that morning, and Gordon wanted me there. The prosecutor is arguing for high bail based on flight risk and the severity of the charges. Your presence might help the judge understand the human impact. So there I was, sitting in a Maricopa County courtroom, watching my son shuffle in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. When his eyes found mine across the room, something flickered in his expression. Shame, fear, regret, before he looked away. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Ramirez, laid out the evidence methodically: the sabotaged brake lines, the tools from the garage, the notebook, the timing of my eviction. She painted a picture of calculated, premeditated, attempted murder, and every word was true. Chris's public defender, a young man who looked fresh out of law school, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the notebook could be interpreted differently, that Chris had no prior criminal record. But when the judge asked him to explain the bottle of acid-laced brake fluid found in Chris's personal toolbox, he had no answer. "Bail is set at $150,000, the judge announced, her voice carrying the weight of finality. The defendant is remanded to custody until trial or until bail is posted. I watched them lead Chris back out. He glanced at me one more time, and this time I saw it clearly. Panic. Pure, undiluted panic. He was finally understanding the consequences of what he'd done. Lisa was in the gallery, her perfect makeup streaked with tears, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. When our eyes met, her expression transformed from grief to fury in an instant. "This is your fault," she hissed as I passed her row. "You're destroying our lives." I stopped, looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd helped drive me from my own home, who'd celebrated my exile, who'd stood by while her husband tried to kill me. "No," I said quietly, "you did this. You and Chris. I'm just making sure you face the consequences." Outside the courthouse, Detective Gordon was waiting. "There's someone I think you should talk to," he said. "A lawyer named Gerald Fisher. He specializes in trusts and estates. Given what Dorothy told you about your father's trust, you might need professional legal advice." Fisher's office was in a sleek building in Scottsdale, all glass and steel. The man himself was in his late 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of navigating complex legal situations. I explained everything: the trust, Chris's attempted murder, the eviction, my current living situation. Fisher listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "Mr. Stewart, you're in a stronger legal position than you might realize. Let me explain what a living trust means in Arizona law." For the next hour, he walked me through the details. My father had created what's called an irrevocable living trust in 1997, naming himself as the trustee and me as the lifetime beneficiary. The house itself belonged to the trust, not to any individual. Upon my father's death, I'd inherited the right to live there, but not ownership, and upon my death, the property would transfer to the veterans of World War II Memorial Foundation, exactly as my father had specified. "What your son doesn't understand," Fisher said, "is that even if his plan had succeeded, even if you died in that brake failure, he would have received nothing. The house would have gone directly to the foundation. All that planning, all that evil, for absolutely nothing." The irony wasn't lost on me. So what do I do now? Now? Fisher smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who saw an opportunity for justice. "Now we go on the offensive. Chris and Lisa have been living in that house for 2 years without your permission, correct? They moved in temporarily. It became permanent. Without a lease agreement, without paying rent. Nothing formal. Chris said they were family, that they were saving money for their own place." Fisher's smile widened. "Then they're trespassers. And given that Chris is now in custody for attempting to murder you, and given that neither he nor Lisa has any legal right to reside in a property owned by a trust, where you are the sole beneficiary, we can file for immediate eviction." Something stirred in my chest. Not quite hope, not quite satisfaction. Something harder, colder. "But there's more," Fisher continued. "We can also file a civil suit against them for unlawful eviction and emotional distress. You were forced from your home, compelled to live in substandard conditions, all while your son was actively trying to kill you. That's worth significant compensation." "How significant?" "Given the circumstances, I'd argue for $50,000 in damages, and I'd win." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Chris was facing criminal charges that could put him away for 15 to 25 years. But even if he somehow beat those charges, which seemed unlikely given the evidence, he and Lisa would still face civil consequences. Eviction, financial penalties, public humiliation. They'd wanted me outside. They'd wanted me gone. They'd celebrated my departure like a victory. Now I was going to take everything from them. "Do it," I said. "File the eviction notice. File the civil suit, all of it." Fisher nodded, already pulling out forms. "We'll need to move quickly. Lisa is still living in the house. The sooner we serve her with eviction papers, the sooner we can get you back into your rightful home." My rightful home. The words felt strange. I'd been living in the Mesa house for weeks now, had started thinking of it as home despite its flaws. But Fisher was right. The Camelback Road house wasn't Chris's. It wasn't Lisa's. It was mine. Or at least I had the right to live there until I died. And I'd be damned if I was going to let them enjoy what they'd stolen while I lived in poverty. The next morning, a process server, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, knocked on the door of 3847 East Camelback Road. Lisa answered, probably expecting news about Chris's bail. Instead, she received an eviction notice and a summons for a civil lawsuit. I wasn't there to see her face, but Detective Gordon, who'd coordinated with the sheriff's office, called me afterward. She went white as a sheet, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Started screaming about her rights, about how she couldn't just be kicked out. The deputy explained that she has no rights to a property she doesn't own and has no legal claim to. She has 14 days to vacate. 14 days. 2 weeks for Lisa to pack up her life and leave the house she'd thought was hers. The house she'd celebrated taking from me. The house my son had been willing to kill me to possess. I stood in the Mesa house's living room, looking at the walls I'd repaired with my own hands, at the windows I'd replaced, at the floor I'd reinforced. This place had been a shelter when I'd had nothing. It had kept me alive, kept me going. But it wasn't home. Not really. Home was where I'd grown up, where my father had taught me to fix engines, where I'd raised Chris before he became what he was now. And in 2 weeks, I'd be going back there. But first, there was something I needed to do, someone I needed to see. Dorothy Miller had given me more than just the trust documents. She'd given me contact information for the Veterans of World War II Memorial Foundation, the charity that would eventually inherit the house. The foundation's director, a retired colonel named Thomas Walsh, had agreed to meet with me. His office was modest, walls covered with photographs of veterans, certificates of appreciation, memorial plaques. Walsh himself was in his 70s, ramrod straight despite his age, eyes still sharp and assessing. "Mr. Stewart," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip, "Dorothy told me about your situation. I'm sorry you've had to go through this." "It's not your fault," I said. "I just wanted to meet the people who will eventually benefit from my father's generosity." We talked for an hour. Walsh explained what the foundation did, helping elderly veterans with medical bills, housing assistance, memorial services. Good work, important work, the kind of thing my father would have wanted to support. "Your father was a World War II veteran?" Walsh asked. "Army. European theater. He didn't talk about it much, but I know he saw some hard combat." Walsh nodded slowly. "Men like your father, they understood sacrifice. They understood protecting something bigger than themselves, creating this trust, making sure the house would benefit other veterans. That's the same instinct that made him serve in the first place." I thought about that, about my father, planning for a future he wouldn't see, protecting his legacy, trying to prevent the exact kind of family conflict that had erupted anyway. He'd been wise, careful. He'd seen the potential for greed and had tried to guard against it. He just hadn't anticipated that his grandson would be willing to commit murder. As I left Walsh's office, something settled in my chest. A sense of purpose, maybe. Or just clarity. My father had wanted to protect the house and support veterans. I was going to honor that. But first, I was going to make sure Chris and Lisa paid for what they'd done. Not just criminally, civilly, personally, completely. They'd wanted to see me outside, homeless, dead. Instead, they were going to watch me take everything they'd hoped to steal, and I was going to make sure they understood exactly what they'd lost. The eviction notice gave Lisa 14 days, but she lasted less than a week. Detective Gordon called me on the 6th day after the papers were served. "She's leaving," he said, "right now." One of our patrol units drove past the house and saw a moving truck. I was in Fisher's office when I got the call, signing documents for the civil suit. I looked at the lawyer, who nodded once. "Let's go see," Fisher said. 20 minutes later, we pulled up across the street from 3847 East Camelback Road. A U-Haul truck was backed into the driveway, and Lisa was directing 2 young men I didn't recognize as they carried furniture out the front door. She looked different, no makeup, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of her usual designer outfits. She looked, I realized, like someone whose world had collapsed. She saw my car, saw me sitting in the passenger seat. For a moment, we locked eyes across the distance. Then she marched over, fury written across every line of her face. "Are you happy now?" she demanded, her voice shrill enough to carry across the street. "Is this what you wanted? To destroy our lives?" I got out of the car slowly, letting her see me, thinner, older, worn down by weeks of poverty and stress, but still standing, still here. "You destroyed your own lives," I said quietly. "I'm just making sure you face the consequences. Chris didn't mean to hurt you. He was stressed about money and I—" She stopped, realizing what she'd almost said. Fisher, standing beside me now, pulled out his phone and started recording. "Please continue, Mrs. Stewart. You were saying your husband was stressed about money?" Lisa's face went through a remarkable transformation, fury to panic to calculation, all in about 3 seconds. She took a step back. "I'm not saying anything else without my lawyer." "That's probably wise," Fisher said mildly. "Though I should inform you that you're being sued for $50,000 in damages for unlawful eviction and emotional distress. You'll be hearing from the court shortly." The color drained from Lisa's face, really drained, went from flushed anger to pale shock, so fast I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "50! You can't? We don't have that kind of money." "Then you probably shouldn't have helped your husband try to murder his father," Fisher said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. It made the words hit harder. Lisa's hands started shaking. She clutched them together, but I could see the tremor running through her whole body. "I didn't know what Chris was doing. I didn't know about the breaks. But you knew about forcing my client from his home." Fisher continued, still in that same mild tone. "You were there when he was thrown out with $20 in a garbage bag. You said, and I quote from Mr. Stewart's statement, 'Finally, our house will be free.' That shows consciousness of wrongdoing." "That's not— I didn't mean—" Lisa looked around wildly as if searching for support, for someone to rescue her. But the moving men had stopped working, were watching the confrontation with obvious interest. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches. Everyone was watching her fall apart. I felt something shift inside me. Not quite satisfaction, not quite triumph. Something colder and harder. The feeling of scales balancing, of justice being measured out in precise portions. "Where will you go?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise her. My sister's, in Tucson. She said I could stay with her until—" She stopped. "Until what? Until Chris got out of jail? That could be years. Until the trial was over. Until they paid the $50,000 they didn't have." "You should go," I said. "Before the sheriff comes back with an escort." That was cruel, but I found I didn't care. She'd stood in my house, and celebrated my exile. She'd probably encouraged Chris's plans, even if she hadn't known about the sabotage. She'd wanted me gone, out of the way, preferably dead, so they could have what they thought was theirs. Lisa turned and fled back to the house. I heard her shouting at the movers to hurry up, to just throw everything in the truck. They needed to leave, now. Fisher and I watched in silence as they finished loading. Lisa came out one last time, carrying a box of what looked like kitchen items. She didn't look at me, just got in her car, a leased BMW that she probably couldn't afford anymore, and sat there, engine running, waiting for the movers to finish. The U-Haul pulled away. Lisa's BMW followed, and just like that, 3,847 East Camelback Road was empty again. "The locks need to be changed immediately," Fisher said, already on his phone. "I'll have a locksmith here within the hour. In the meantime, let's take a look inside." The front door was unlocked. We went in. The house looked violated. That was the only word for it. They'd taken some furniture, probably the expensive pieces Lisa had bought, but left the rest in disarray. Drawers hung open, closets gaped empty. There was trash scattered across the kitchen counter. In the living room, I found deep scratches on the hardwood floor where they'd dragged something heavy, but it was the garage that made my chest tighten. My Indian chief was still there, partially disassembled, parts scattered across the workbench, but Chris had been using the space for his own purposes too. I found the area where he'd kept his tools, empty now, taken by the police as evidence. There was an oil stain on the concrete where my truck used to park. For 2 years I'd worked in this garage on my motorcycle, never knowing that my son was sabotaging my vehicle just a few feet away. "You okay?" Fisher asked from the doorway. "I will be," I said, and I meant it. This space had been poisoned by what Chris did here, but I could reclaim it, clean it, make it mine again. A car pulled up outside, the locksmith. While he worked on changing the locks, I walked through the rest of the house. My old bedroom, where I'd found Chris and Lisa packing my things into garbage bags. The kitchen, where we'd had family dinners back before everything went wrong. The bathroom, where I'd bandaged Chris's skinned knees when he was little. Every room held memories, some good, some poisoned by recent events. But they were my memories, in my house, or at least the house where I had the right to live until I died. My phone rang. Detective Gordon. "Just wanted to update you," he said. "Chris's bail hearing was this morning. Lisa tried to make bail using her car as collateral, but it wasn't enough. He's staying in custody until trial." "When will that be?" "Prosecutor is pushing for a fast trial, probably within 3 months. The evidence is solid, and there's no point dragging it out." 3 months. Chris would spend at least 3 more months in jail, thinking about what he'd done, about the house he'd tried to kill me for but would never have, about the life he'd destroyed. "There's something else," Gordon continued. "We searched Chris's email and found correspondence with his bank. He's got credit card debt of about $127,000, car payments, a boat he bought last year that he couldn't afford, membership fees at some country club. He was drowning financially." The pieces clicked into place. Chris had been living beyond his means, accumulating debt, probably with Lisa pushing him to maintain a certain lifestyle. The house on Camelback Road, which he thought was worth nearly $900,000, must have seemed like the solution to all his problems. Sell it, pay off the debts, start fresh. Except he couldn't sell it while I was alive and living there, so he'd tried to kill me. And when that took too long, he'd just kicked me out instead, figuring he'd deal with the legal details after I was dead. "He gambled everything on a house he was never going to get," I said. "That about sums it up," Gordon agreed. "The prosecutor wants to use the financial records at trial. Shows motive." After Gordon hung up, I stood in the empty living room of my house and tried to feel something. Triumph, satisfaction, victory. What I felt was tired and old and sad that it had come to this. But I also felt something else. Determination. This house was mine for as long as I lived. The trust my father created would protect it. And when I was gone, it would help other veterans, men like my father, men who'd sacrificed for something bigger than themselves. Chris and Lisa had wanted to steal that legacy. They'd wanted to turn my father's careful planning into their personal windfall. Instead, Chris was in jail awaiting trial for attempted murder. Lisa was fleeing to Tucson with whatever she could pack into a U-Haul, and I was standing in my house, holding new keys, ready to start reclaiming my life. Fisher appeared in the doorway. "Locks are changed. I took the liberty of having the locksmith make 3 sets of keys. One for you, one for me to hold in escrow, and one for Dorothy Miller as the trustee's representative. Is there anything else you need?" I looked around the house. It would need cleaning, some repairs. I'd have to move my few possessions from the Mesa house. Decide what to do with that property. Maybe sell it, or maybe keep it as a rental. A reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come back. "No," I said. "I think this is enough for today." As I walked out to Fisher's car for the ride back to Mesa, I took one last look at 3847 East Camelback Road. The house where I'd grown up, where I'd raised my son, where that son had tried to kill me. But also the house where I'd survived, where I'd fought back, where I'd proven that being thrown outside didn't mean being destroyed. Chris had screamed at me, "Your place is outside." He was wrong. My place was here. And it was Chris who'd ended up outside. Outside of freedom, outside of his father's life, outside of the inheritance he'd thought was his. The scales were balancing. Justice was being measured out. And I was just getting started. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur of activity. I moved back into the Camelback Roadhouse, bringing the few possessions I'd accumulated in Mesa. The contrast was startling, going from a house I'd rebuilt with my own desperate hands to the home I'd lived in my entire life. But it wasn't the same house anymore. Chris and Lisa had left their mark everywhere. Different paint colors, furniture rearranged, small changes that added up to make the place feel foreign, violated, I spent days cleaning, reorganizing, trying to make it feel like mine again. The Mesa house I decided to keep. Fisher helped me set it up as a rental property. Nothing fancy, but it would provide a little income and serve as a reminder. A reminder of where I'd been, what I'd survived, how close I'd come to losing everything. The civil suit moved forward. Lisa, now living with her sister in Tucson, had hired a lawyer, a tired-looking man who seemed to know his client had no real defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The eviction had been illegal, I'd suffered demonstrable harm, and Lisa had been an active participant. The settlement hearing was set for late June, just before the criminal trial was scheduled to begin. I spent that time working on the Indian chief. The motorcycle had sat neglected during all the chaos, but now I had time to finish what I'd started 5 years ago. Each evening I'd go into the garage, the same garage where Chris had sabotaged my truck, and work on the bike, cleaning away the poison of what had happened there, one restored part at a time. Ron Cooper stopped by one afternoon bringing pizza and beer. We sat in the garage and he examined my work on the Chief. "Beautiful restoration," he said, running his hand over the rebuilt engine. "Your son tried to destroy you, but you're the one building things, creating. That says something." "It says I'm stubborn," I replied. "It says you're stronger than they thought you were." He took a sip of beer. "When's the criminal trial?" "Early August. Prosecutor says it's airtight. The notebook alone would convict him, but with the physical evidence, the text messages, the financial motive, she says it's one of the strongest attempted murder cases she's ever seen." Ron nodded slowly. "How do you feel about that?" How did I feel? I'd spent weeks asking myself that question. I feel like justice is being served. I don't feel good about it. He's still my son, no matter what he did. But I feel like it's right. Necessary. "That's healthy," Ron said. "A lot of people in your position would either want blood or would be in denial. You're doing neither. You're just dealing with reality." The civil case settled on a warm afternoon in late June. Lisa's lawyer had convinced her to accept the terms rather than go to trial. $32,000 in damages, to be paid through wage garnishment and asset seizure over the next several years. She'd have to sell the BMW she'd leased, liquidate what little savings she had, and then pay a portion of her waitress wages until the debt was satisfied. Fisher called me with the news. She caved completely, didn't even try to negotiate. I think the reality of the criminal trial starting soon made her realize she needed to cut her losses. $32,000, I said. It was less than the $50 we'd asked for, but still significant. "That seems fair. More importantly, it's a legal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She's admitting on the record that she participated in illegally evicting you. That could be useful if the prosecutor decides to bring charges against her too. But they didn't. Detective Gordon called a few days later to explain. "We just don't have enough evidence that Lisa knew about the brake sabotage. The text messages show she knew Chris wanted you gone, but not that she knew about the murder plot specifically. The DA doesn't think she can prove conspiracy to commit murder, so she's not filing charges." "So Lisa walks?" "From criminal charges, yes. But she's lost everything else. Her husband, her home, her lifestyle, her reputation. And she's paying you back for years to come. That's not nothing." He was right. Lisa had wanted to be a wealthy woman living in a beautiful house. Instead, she was a divorced waitress in Tucson, garnishing her wages to pay restitution for evicting an old man. She hadn't gone to prison, but her life had been destroyed just the same. The criminal trial was set to begin on the first Monday of August. As the date approached, I found myself growing quieter, more introspective. I'd been so focused on the practical aspects, the evidence, the lawyers, the procedures, that I hadn't really processed the emotional weight of what was coming. I was going to sit in a courtroom and watch my son be convicted of trying to murder me. Dorothy Miller stopped by one evening bringing documents for me to review and sign, routine trust administration paperwork. She found me in the garage, polishing chrome on the Indian chief. "It's almost done," she said, admiring the bike. "Just a few more details. I'm thinking I'll take it for a real ride after the trial. Clear my head." She nodded, understanding. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep thinking I should feel something more. Angrier or sadder or something. But I just feel numb." "That's normal. You've been running on adrenaline and determination for months. Now that the finish line is in sight, your body and mind are protecting you from the full emotional impact. It'll hit you later, probably when you least expect it. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. No one ever is, Dorothy said gently, but you'll get through it. You've survived everything else. The weekend before the trial, Colonel Walsh from the Veterans Foundation called. I wanted to reach out before things get difficult, he said. Let you know that we're thinking of you. What you're going through, testifying against your own son, that takes courage. It takes necessity, I corrected. He tried to kill me. There's no courage in stating facts. There's courage in facing them, Walsh replied. A lot of people would run from this. Deny it, hide from it, try to protect their child no matter what. You're standing up for yourself and for justice. That matters. After he hung up, I sat in my living room in my house, and thought about what he'd said, standing up for justice. Is that what I was doing? Or was I just a tired old man who'd been pushed too far and was pushing back? Maybe it was both. Sunday evening, the night before the trial began, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The gaunt, desperate man I'd been in Mesa was gone. I'd regained some weight, though not all. The dark circles under my eyes had faded, but there was something different in my expression now. Harder, older in a way that had nothing to do with years. I'd survived being thrown out of my home, survived living in poverty, survived discovering my son had tried to murder me, survived the investigation, the arrest, the legal proceedings. Tomorrow I'd survive watching him be convicted, and somehow, after all of it, I'd find a way to keep surviving. Because that's what I did now. I survived, and I was getting very, very good at it. The Maricopa County Superior Courthouse was busier than I'd expected that Monday morning. I arrived early, wearing the one decent suit I still owned, the same suit I'd worn to my retirement party from Southwest Airlines, a lifetime ago. Fisher met me at the entrance. Ready? As I'll ever be. The courtroom was smaller than it looked on TV. Wood paneling, rows of benches, the judge's bench looming over everything. I took my seat in the gallery, just behind the prosecution table, where Patricia Ramirez was organizing her files. Then they brought Chris in. He'd changed even more in the months since I'd last seen him. Prison had carved away everything soft about him. He was thin, his skin had an unhealthy pallor, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were hollow. The jury selection had happened the previous week. 12 people who knew nothing about the case, who'd promised to be impartial, who would decide my son's fate. They filed in, looking nervous and serious. Judge Harrison entered. We all stood. The state of Arizona versus Christopher James Stewart, she announced. We are here for trial on charges of attempted murder in the first degree and unlawful eviction. Ms. Ramirez, your opening statement. The prosecutor stood, walked to face the jury, and began to lay out the case with devastating clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next few weeks, you're going to hear about a crime that was 2 years in the making, a crime committed by a son against his father, a crime motivated by greed, executed with patience, and documented in the defendant's own handwriting. She walked them through it methodically. The living trust that meant Chris would never inherit the house, the mounting debts, $127,000, the sabotage brake lines, the notebook where Chris had recorded each act of sabotage, the text messages with Lisa, the violent eviction with $20. The evidence will show that Christopher Stewart spent 2 years planning to murder his father, Delbert Stewart. When that plan took too long, he threw his father out of his own home, hoping poverty or a delayed brake failure would finish the job. This is not a case about family conflict or financial stress. This is attempted murder, premeditated and methodical, and the evidence will prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. Chris's defense attorney, a man named David Carlson, tried to paint a different picture in his opening. Financial stress, yes. Poor judgment, certainly. But murder? The prosecution will try to turn maintenance notes into a murder plot. They'll try to turn family conflict into criminal intent. But at the end of this trial, you'll see that Christopher Stewart, while guilty of terrible judgment and hurtful actions, is not a murderer. He never intended to kill his father. He was a desperate man who made desperate choices. But desperation is not the same as murderous intent. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next 2 weeks with brutal efficiency. Ron Cooper testified first, explaining the brake line sabotage in terms even non-mechanics could understand. He brought blown-up photographs, pointed out the scoring, the chemical damage, the systematic nature of the destruction. This wasn't accidental wear, Ron said firmly. This was deliberate, patient sabotage designed to cause brake failure that would look like natural deterioration. The forensics technician followed, explaining how the metal particles and chemicals found on Chris's tools matched exactly what had been used to damage the brake lines. Then came the notebook. Detective Gordon read entries aloud while the jury followed along with photocopies. The dates, the descriptions of each sabotage session, the calculations about when the brakes might fail. It read like a project plan for murder, because that's exactly what it was. He kept track like it was a home improvement project, Ramirez said during her questioning. Does that suggest someone acting in the heat of the moment, or someone methodically planning a crime? The latter, Gordon replied. This shows planning, patience, and clear intent. The text messages came next. The prosecutor displayed them on screens around the courtroom, reading them aloud so everyone could hear Chris and Lisa casually discussing my death, as if it were an inevitability they were simply waiting for. Lisa wasn't called as a witness. She'd taken the Fifth Amendment, refusing to testify, but her words in those messages spoke for her anyway. Then it was my turn. Walking to the witness stand felt surreal. The bailiff swore me in. I sat down, finally looking directly at Chris. He was crying again, silent tears streaming down his face. Ramirez's questions were gentle but thorough. I described the last 2 years, Chris's increasing hostility, his frequent offers to help with the truck, the sudden violent eviction, living in the Mesa house barely surviving, the discovery of the sabotage. When Ron Cooper showed you the brake lines, Ramirez asked, what went through your mind? I realized my son had been trying to kill me, I said simply. For 2 years, every time I drove that truck, I was risking my life because he'd sabotaged it. And when I didn't die fast enough, he threw me out with $20, hoping I'd die another way. How did that make you feel? Carlson objected. Calls for speculation about emotional state. But the judge overruled him. Betrayed, I said, heartbroken, and angry. I'd raised him, loved him, and he tried to murder me for money he was never going to get anyway. Carlson's cross-examination tried to soften the impact, suggested that maybe I'd misunderstood Chris's intentions, that maybe the eviction had been harsh but not criminal, that maybe I was exaggerating the danger of the brake sabotage. Mr. Stewart, he said in his most sympathetic voice, isn't it possible that your son was actually trying to help maintain your vehicle, and you've misinterpreted his actions? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket, a photocopy of one of Chris's notebook entries. Would you like me to read the entry from April 15th, 2024? I asked. Where my son wrote, and I quote, applied additional corrosive solution to rear brake lines. Deterioration progressing well. Estimate complete failure within 6 to 8 weeks. Once accident occurs, can proceed with house sale. I looked directly at Carlson. That doesn't sound like maintenance to me, counselor. That sounds like murder. The courtroom was silent. Carlson had no response. He dismissed me after a few more perfunctory questions that went nowhere. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks of testimony. The defense case took less than 3 days. Carlson called character witnesses, people who'd known Chris before all this, who testified that he'd been a good person once. He called a financial counselor who explained how debt can drive people to desperation. He called a psychologist who talked about the stress of financial pressure. But he never put Chris on the stand, couldn't risk it. The evidence was too damning, and Chris would have been destroyed on cross-examination. Finally, closing arguments. Ramirez stood before the jury one last time. Christopher Stewart spent 2 years planning to murder his father. He documented his crime in his own handwriting. He discussed it with his wife in text messages. He executed his plan with patience and precision. When that plan took too long, when his father didn't die fast enough, he threw him out onto the street with $20. This isn't about financial stress or poor judgment. This is about a man who decided his father's life was worth less than a house he wouldn't have inherited anyway. The evidence proves attempted murder beyond any reasonable doubt. It's time for justice. Carlson's closing was weaker. He argued mitigation, not innocence. Chris Stewart made terrible choices. He hurt his father terribly, but he didn't actually kill anyone. No one died. He deserves punishment, yes, but not for attempted murder. The prosecution hasn't proven murderous intent beyond reasonable doubt. But the jury's faces said otherwise. They deliberated for 3.5 hours. When they returned, I watched Chris's face as the forewoman stood. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. Chris's head dropped to the table. His shoulders shook with sobs. On the charge of unlawful eviction, guilty. It was over. The jury had spoken. My son was a convicted attempted murderer. Judge Harrison set sentencing for 2 weeks later and remanded Chris to custody. As they let him out, he looked at me one final time. His face was destroyed, swollen red, tears streaming. His mouth formed words, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I nodded once. Acknowledgement, not forgiveness. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried to get a statement. Fisher shooed them away. Detective Gordon shook my hand. "Justice served," he said quietly. "Not yet," I replied. "Not until sentencing." But the hardest part was over. The truth was out. 12 people had looked at all the evidence and declared what I'd known since that day at Cooper's Auto Repair. My son had tried to kill me. Now we just had to see what price he'd pay. I drove home in my repaired F-150, the new brake lines working perfectly. The house on Camelback Road waited for me, truly mine now in a way it hadn't been since Chris and Lisa moved in. I parked in the garage next to the nearly complete Indian Chief, ran my hand over the restored chrome. Soon I'd take it for a ride, feel the wind, the freedom, the proof that I'd survived. But not yet. First, sentencing. First, the final chapter of this nightmare. Then maybe I could start to heal. The summer heat had given way to autumn cool by the time Chris's sentencing hearing arrived. I'd been back in the Camelback Road house for months now, slowly making it mine again. The garage was clean, the Indian Chief reassembled, and running. I'd taken it for its first ride in years, feeling the rumble of that restored engine beneath me like a promise kept. But today, I was in a Maricopa County courtroom, watching my son stand trial for trying to kill me. The prosecutor, Patricia Ramirez, had built her case methodically over the summer. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every damning detail had been catalogued and prepared for presentation to the jury. Now, sitting in the gallery, I watched her lay it all out with surgical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this is a case about greed, about patience, and about a man who spent 2 years planning the murder of his own father." Chris sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit right anymore. He'd lost weight in jail, his shoulders hunched, his face gaunt. He didn't look at me, hadn't looked at me since the trial started. The first witness was Ron Cooper. He took the stand with his mechanic's hands folded carefully in his lap and explained, in clear, simple terms, what he'd found on my truck. The brake lines had been filed down systematically, Ron said, pointing to blown-up photographs displayed on screens around the courtroom. "See these marks? That's not natural wear. That's deliberate scoring. And here," he indicated the pitted metal, "this is chemical corrosion. Someone applied an acidic solution to weaken the metal structure over time." "How long would this process take?" Ramirez asked. "Based on the extent of damage? At least 18 months. Probably closer to 2 years. This wasn't a one-time sabotage. This was methodical, repeated application of force and chemicals, designed to make the brake lines fail gradually, so it would look like natural deterioration. And what would have happened when these brake lines failed? Ron's expression darkened. At highway speed? Total brake failure. The driver would have had no way to stop. At 65, 70 miles per hour, that's almost certainly fatal. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I saw one of the jurors, a woman about my age, shake her head slowly. Next came the forensic technician who'd examined my truck. She testified about the residue found on Chris's tools, metal particles and chemical compounds that matched exactly what had been used to sabotage the brake lines. Then Detective Gordon took the stand. He described the search of the garage, the discovery of the notebook where Chris had documented his crime. "Can you read some of the entries?" Ramirez asked. Gordon opened the notebook, now marked as evidence. March 15th, 2023. Applied solution to rear lines, barely visible. March 29th. Filed front passenger line, quarter inch. April 12th. Reapplied solution, both rear lines showing good deterioration. It went on. Page after page of my son's handwriting, documenting each step of his plan to kill me. The courtroom was silent except for Gordon's voice, reading those terrible entries. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand on legs that felt unsteady. The bailiff swore me in. I sat down, finally looking directly at Chris. He was crying, silent tears running down his face, his shoulders shaking. Too late for that, I thought. Ramirez's questions were gentle but thorough. I described the last 2 years, Chris's increasing hostility, his frequent help with the truck, the sudden eviction. I kept my voice steady, stating facts, not emotions. "And when you discovered the sabotage," Ramirez asked, "what did you think?" "I thought my son had tried to murder me," I said simply, "for a house he would never inherit." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Carlson, tried to shake my testimony on cross-examination, suggested that maybe I'd misunderstood Chris's intentions, that the notebook could be interpreted as maintenance records gone wrong, that the chemicals could have been used for legitimate purposes. "Mr. Stewart," he said, his tone sympathetic but probing, "isn't it possible that your son was actually trying to maintain your vehicle, and these were simply notes about repairs he planned to make?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I pulled out my own notebook, one I'd been carrying since the discovery. "Would you like me to read from the text messages between my son and his wife that the police recovered? The ones where they discussed waiting for the old man to have his accident and calculating how much money they'd get from selling the house?" Carlson paled. "Your Honor, that evidence hasn't been— It's in discovery," Ramirez said smoothly. "I was planning to introduce it this afternoon." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Mr. Stewart, you may answer." I didn't need to read them. The jury could see them for themselves when Ramirez presented them. Instead, I just looked at Carlson and said, "My son documented his plan to kill me in his own handwriting. He sabotaged my vehicle over a period of 2 years. He threw me out of my home with $20. No, counselor, there's no misunderstanding here." The text messages came next. Ramirez read them aloud, each one more damning than the last. Lisa to Chris, "How much longer? We can't keep waiting forever." Chris to Lisa, "The brake lines are almost gone. One more application and they'll fail within a month. Just be patient." Lisa to Chris, "What if he doesn't drive enough? What if it takes too long?" Chris to Lisa, "Then we'll figure something else out. But one way or another, we're getting that house." There were dozens of them, hundreds maybe. All plotting, planning, calculating, discussing not whether to kill me, but how and when. The defense tried to argue that these were just words, that people say things they don't mean in private conversations, but combined with the physical evidence, the notebook, the tools, the timeline, it was overwhelming. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness, expert after expert, all building an unassailable case. Finally, closing arguments. Ramirez stood before the jury, her voice calm but forceful. Christopher Stewart spent 2 years planning to murder his father. He documented his crime in his own handwriting. He discussed it with his wife in text messages. He executed his plan with patience and precision. And when that plan took too long, when his father didn't die fast enough, he threw him out onto the street with $20, hoping poverty or desperation would finish what the sabotage brakes hadn't. This isn't a case about misunderstanding or poor judgment. This is attempted murder, cold and calculated. The defense's closing was weaker. Carlson argued that Chris had been under financial pressure, that he'd made terrible mistakes, but hadn't actually killed anyone, that he deserved mercy. But you could see it in the jury's faces. They'd made up their minds. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. When they filed back in, I watched Chris's face. He was white as paper, trembling visibly. Lisa wasn't in the courtroom. She'd stopped coming after the second day, unable to face the evidence of what her husband had done, what she'd encouraged. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." Chris's head dropped to the table. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Chris shook it off, his whole body shaking with sobs. "On the charge of criminal trespass and unlawful eviction." "Guilty." 2 for 2. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. As they led Chris out of the courtroom, he finally looked at me. His face was destroyed. Red, swollen, tears streaming. His mouth formed words. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." I nodded once. Acknowledgement, not forgiveness. Outside the courthouse, Detective Gordon shook my hand. "Justice served," he said. "Not quite," I replied. "Not until sentencing." But I felt something shift. The worst was over. The truth was out. A jury of 12 people had looked at all the evidence and declared what I'd known since that day in Ron Cooper's garage. My son had tried to kill me. Now we just had to see what price he'd pay for it. The sentencing hearing was on a cool morning in October. I drove to the courthouse in my repaired F-150. Ron had replaced the brake lines, done a complete safety inspection, made sure everything was perfect. The truck ran better than it had in years. The courtroom was less crowded this time. Just the necessary parties, the judge, the attorneys, Chris, a handful of observers, and me. Chris looked worse than he had at trial. Prison had hollowed him out, turned him gray. When they brought him in, shuffling in shackles, he looked like an old man. Hard to believe this was the same person who'd thrown me out of my house with such contempt just months ago. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Harrison, reviewed the case file in silence for several minutes. Then she looked up. "Mr. Stewart," she said, addressing Chris, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of attempted murder in the first degree and unlawful eviction. Before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything you wish to say?" Chris stood shakily. His attorney whispered something to him, but he shook his head. "Your Honor," Chris said, his voice barely audible, "I know there's nothing I can say that will make this better. I tried to kill my own father. I threw him out of his home. I did it for money, for a house I didn't even have the right to inherit. Every day in jail I've had to face what I am, what I became, and I—" His voice broke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He turned to look at me directly. "Dad, I know you can't forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that I remember who you were to me. When I was little, you were my hero. You taught me right from wrong. And somewhere along the way, I forgot all of it. I let greed turn me into someone who could hurt you. Someone who could plan your death like it was just another problem to solve. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it." Judge Harrison's expression didn't change. "Mr. Stewart, this court has reviewed the evidence presented at trial. The systematic sabotage of your father's vehicle over a 2-year period. The documentation of your crime in your own handwriting. The text messages with your wife discussing your father's death as if it were an inevitability you were simply waiting for. This was not a crime of passion. This was cold, calculated, and patient. You spent 2 years planning to murder the man who raised you, and when that plan moved too slowly for your taste, you evicted him from his own home with $20. She paused, letting that sink in. The court notes that you have expressed remorse, but the court also notes that this remorse appeared only after you were caught, arrested, and convicted. There is no evidence that you felt any regret while committing these crimes. In fact, the evidence shows the opposite, that you celebrated each step toward your goal. Chris's shoulders slumped. Attempted murder in the first degree in Arizona carries a sentence of 7 to 21 years in prison. The unlawful eviction adds additional time. Given the egregious nature of these crimes, the extended planning period, the complete betrayal of trust, and the vulnerability of the victim, your own elderly father, this court sentences you to the maximum, 21 years in the Arizona state prison system, with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. 21 years. Chris would be nearly 60 when he got out, if he got out. The courtroom was silent. Chris swayed, and his attorney grabbed his arm to steady him. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, you are ordered to pay restitution of $32,000 for the unlawful eviction, plus court costs and fees. Do you understand this sentence? Yes, Your Honor, Chris whispered. They led him away. He looked back at me one more time, and I saw complete devastation in his eyes. The reality of 21 years in prison was settling in. By the time he got out, if he got out, I'd likely be dead. He'd lost everything. His freedom, his wife, Lisa had already filed for divorce, his future, and his father. All for a house he could never have inherited anyway. Outside the courthouse, Fisher was waiting. The civil case settles next week, he said. The $32,000 will be garnished from both Chris and Lisa's assets. Lisa's already filed for bankruptcy, but we'll get what we can. I don't care about the money, I said, and I didn't. The money had never been the point. I know, but it's about the principle. They tried to take everything from you. It's only fair they pay something back. The final civil hearing was perfunctory. Lisa didn't even show up. She'd moved to Tucson, was living with her sister, working as a waitress. Her lawyer appeared on her behalf, signed the settlement documents, and left. The garnishment orders were issued. Over the next several years, I'd receive payments toward the $32,000, though I knew I'd probably never see all of it. A week later, I met with Gerald Fisher and Colonel Walsh from the Veterans of World War II Memorial Foundation in Fisher's office. We reviewed the trust documents, made sure everything was in order. Your father set this up to last beyond his lifetime, Walsh said. When the house eventually transfers to the foundation, we'll use it to help veterans and their families. House a veteran who's fallen on hard times. Provide transitional housing. Your father's legacy will live on. I signed some additional paperwork, confirming my understanding of the trust, my role as lifetime beneficiary, the foundation's eventual inheritance. It felt right. My father had known what he was doing. That evening, I was in the garage, working on the Indian Chief. The bike was fully restored now, running perfectly. I'd taken it out several times, feeling the power and freedom of the open road. There was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I wiped my hands and answered. A courier stood there with a letter, certified mail from the Arizona State Prison. I signed for it, closed the door, and opened the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago. Inside was a letter from Chris. 4 pages, handwritten, the words sometimes smudged as if tears had fallen on them. Dad, it began, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to respond. But I need to say these things even if you never hear them. I read it all, every word, the apologies, the explanations that weren't really explanations, the regrets that came too late. He wrote about lying awake in his cell, thinking about what he'd done, about the house he'd tried to steal that was never his to begin with, about the father he'd tried to murder, for money that wouldn't have existed. I threw away everything that mattered for something that was never real, he wrote, and now I have nothing but time to think about what I've lost. I read to the end. Then I sat at my kitchen table, my table in my house, and thought about what to write back. It took me an hour to compose 3 sentences. Chris, I forgive you as a father because that's what fathers do. But as a man who almost died because of your greed, I will never forget what you did. Your place truly is outside now, outside of freedom, outside of my life, outside of the inheritance you thought was yours. Maybe 21 years will teach you to value life more than money. I didn't sign it, Dad, just Delbert Stewart. I sealed the envelope, addressed it to the prison, and put it in my mailbox. Then I went back to the garage. The Indian Chief sat there, chrome gleaming under the work lights. I ran my hand over the restored fuel tank, feeling the smooth finish, the quality of work I'd put into bringing this machine back to life. Chris had tried to destroy me, had spent 2 years planning my death, had thrown me out onto the street to die in poverty. Instead, I was here, in my house, with my restored motorcycle, with my dignity intact and justice served. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd won. The scales had balanced. The man who'd screamed, "Your place is outside," was now the one behind bars, locked outside of society, outside of freedom, outside of everything he'd tried to steal. And me? I was home. I fired up the Indian Chief. The engine caught on the first try, settling into a perfect idle. I sat on the bike, feeling its power, its restoration complete. Tomorrow I'd take it for a ride, feel the Arizona wind in my face, remind myself that I was still here, still alive, still free. Life continues. Justice was served, and I had won. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.